It was so obvious that this had to come from the EU again. We have the next attempt to ban Bitcoin mining, this time directly from the European Commission, led by President von der Leyen. Of course, not in the entire EU, but here in Transnistria. The ultimate goal here is to blackmail the country into banning Bitcoin. It is said in an article here that Europe is offering money for gas to Russian regions if they stop operating cryptocurrency forms. It's not just about Bitcoin, it's about all forms of cryptocurrency in the end. They're positioning themselves as the saviors of the world, saying, hey, you'll get help and so on. But for that, you have to meet some very specific conditions. And that's basically similar to the IMF, because they do the same thing with the SAW or with other countries. They say, okay, hey, you'll get help from us, you'll get loans. But you only get the loans and the money if you stop Bitcoin mining, if you revoke the Bitcoin law, and so on. I mean, there's no Bitcoin law here, but this is still about Bitcoin mining. Bitcoin cannot be banned. That has to be clear. You can only pause it temporarily here, but globally, you can't ban Bitcoin. So you really don't need to panic about it. That doesn't mean it's the case in other countries, just here in Transnistria. But we'll take a closer look at it in a moment. Here it says that the European Commission is informing the authorities in Transnistria that they have to accept the conditions to continue receiving subsidized gas supplies. So maybe I'm interpreting this wrong, but to me, it really feels a bit like blackmail. Feel free to write in the comments whether you see this as blackmail or if you think of it as a humanitarian act from the EU, from the European Commission, which is also largely directed here. From von der Leyen, I mean, usually nothing good comes from what they're doing here, whether it's related to Bitcoin or something else. Everything that's somehow centrally controlled by the EU doesn't seem to have that stamp of freedom on it. Instead, it's mostly about harassing people, restricting them, and increasing surveillance. And we'll also take a look at how this came about, why Bitcoin mining is being banned here now, and why there was Bitcoin mining happening here in Transnistria before. I mean, there are now power shortages and so on. There are electricity problems. So I can kind of understand why they might say, okay, let's prioritize households for now, and industrial operations have to be scaled back first. I can definitely understand that a bit. But you could also regulate it through prices. We've seen this in other regions around the world as well. Russia, it was also the case that they just said, okay, in 8 regions or so, Bitcoin mining is completely banned temporarily because they have electricity problems here. Back then, during the China mining ban, that was basically the excuse. They also said, okay, we're banning Bitcoin mining because there's not even enough electricity to keep the traffic lights running, and so on. But at the same time, you have to say that these are often just excuses because in the end, miners, yeah, they take excess electricity, but they only go for the cheap power. And when there are power shortages here, miners usually become unprofitable anyway because the electricity prices shoot up. Except for that, the Bitcoin miners are hooked up to excess energy, where there's basically no supply going to places where the electricity can't even be fed into the general grid. And then they still say, okay, they have to be shut down anyway. That's the condition. We have to wipe out all the Bitcoin miners here. And that's definitely like a Bitcoin ban. I don't know if that's going to be long-term or just temporary. But here we have the next attempt at a Bitcoin mining ban. At least, that's my assessment. Feel free to write in the comments how you see it. But it actually gets even better. It's referred to as the Russian breakaway region of Transnistria in Moldova. They would be offered help to tackle their energy crisis, but only on the condition that they improve their human rights situation. So that sounds pretty crazy at first. It says that they need to improve their human rights situation and no longer operate energy-intensive cryptocurrency farms. So they basically wrap up the human rights situation in just one sentence. The crypto mining farms are really, really bad. Human rights, I find it really, really hard to assess. I don't know if the human rights issues are specifically referring to Bitcoin mining or if that's just an additional point. I really don't know in the end. I don't want to blame anyone for that. But you have to say that this absolutely fits into the lines of the EU. That means there are other countries like the USA that are opening up here. Donald Trump says he wants the remaining Bitcoin in the world. Everyone is mining in the USA. And the EU is really shutting itself off here. I'll say it again. They're recklessly putting prosperity at risk. Although this is a special case, when there are energy shortages and stuff like that, I can somewhat understand it when they say, okay, they want to focus on certain regions to scale back so that at least the regular households can still get some electricity. You often do that when there are blackouts or something like that. And once that's scaled back, the energy mix or the grid looks a lot better. And then you might be able to stabilize it a bit. And as soon as the energy problems are resolved, then you basically let the industrial operations run again, doing some kind of Bitcoin mining stuff or whatever, or they allow other energy-intensive practices here in the country again. There's also a little explanation here. Transnistria received supplies from the Russian gas company Gazprom for 2 decades through the Ukrainian pipeline network for free, while Russia viewed these supplies as humanitarian aid for the region where it maintained a military base. And then it basically says here that the supplies would be cut off on January 1st, after the gas transit agreement expired on December 31st. The stop caused energy shortages throughout Moldova and affected production at the country's largest power plant, which is located in Transnistria and supplies most of Moldova's electricity. In the end, you can see why this is happening. The gas pipelines have now been cut off. And now, basically, the EU has a really strong negotiating position. They can still provide humanitarian aid, but then they set conditions again. That's basically what happens a lot. From some really friendly countries or really humanitarian countries. So they say, okay, you get our humanitarian aid, but only if you meet the conditions here. And the whole thing has a very bad taste because it is not said here that, for example, other energy-intensive things should be scaled back. At least, I don't see that in the article. So I mean, if they start putting bans in place, like saying, okay, the steel construction industry is now banned because it's too energy intensive, or we ban the AI industry here because it's too energy intensive. But that seems to be tolerated. It's only with Bitcoin mining that people keep hammering on it. So from what it looks like here, Bitcoin mining is supposed to be scaled back. We also have the statements now. By now, we've heard from people like Christine Lagarde from the ECB, from several folks at the ECB, not just from employees like Jürgen Schaaf and Binzeit, but also from China, from Christine Lagarde. We now know virtually in person that you all think Bitcoin is crap. I don't even know if Ursula von der Leyen has ever officially made a statement about Bitcoin. But if I know their value context, then I could imagine that they're not really into Bitcoin. And then you can basically exploit that emergency situation. Where people are basically in need, you can just say, okay, we're killing two birds with one stone. We're pretending to offer humanitarian aid, but at the same time, we're not giving that aid unconditionally. Giving people something, because in the end, that's always what you call unconditional love when you say, okay, you can use it, but you can also do whatever you want with it. I found a few more pieces of information here. It's basically describing why the Bitcoin mining ban is supposed to come into effect here. It says that crypto mining consumes up to 40 megawatt hours per day, even during power outages that affected 350,000 residents. It is of course understandable that when there are power outages here, you ultimately just look at which sources you can switch off. But again, the Bitcoin miners are very likely not even connected to the power grid, but they often just use excess energy. But I'm just not sure about that. I'm not from Transnistria. I didn't even know they were doing Bitcoin mining there. But apparently, they had very cheap gas from the Russians for a long time. And then you could probably be very efficient here. Bitcoin mining, although I don't know if it's just powered by gas here or if there's solar energy too, or maybe wind or whatever else they have. Solar energy is probably less likely since it's likely in a colder region. But yeah, there are a whole bunch of different forms of energy that could be considered. It also says here what changes have already come into effect. Transnistria lifted its ban on February. They introduced their blockchain law and closed tax-exempt mining farms. So apparently it was actually the case that the mining farms were tax-exempt. Now they've basically done a complete 180 saying, okay, they're closed now. So that means they've pretty much enforced the ban here as I understand it. Bitcoin mining has been banned here in Transnistria for 2 days. And they've even closed the tax-exempt mining farms here. And in my opinion, that's definitely not a good sign that they're taking such radical action here. You could at least say, okay, they're just putting a temporary stop to it or something, but to just completely shut them down and close them like this is something else. That's definitely a big shocker. It also says here, energy at market prices. Big companies have to pay full prices and subsidies are being lifted in their favor. Industries close to Russia have to be shut down. I mean, I can totally understand why they're lifting the subsidies now. It wouldn't be a problem at all if we simply said, okay, we'll abolish the subsidies. And if they lift the subsidies here for industrial companies, then the Bitcoin mining industry would probably just shut down voluntarily because the electricity prices would get too high. And if they really have to get gas here, they might just say, hey, we're opting out. Then it would just be handled through market mechanisms. But it seems that they want to send a clear message here saying, okay, we are not going to regulate this through the market by simply making Bitcoin mining less attractive through higher electricity prices. Instead, we're taking it a step further and just saying we're shutting everything down and putting the miners out of business. I don't want to blame the EU or the European Commission or anything like that and say they're really bad or something. Maybe I actually misjudged this here. I'm actually not 100% sure here because I just don't know the background. I don't know much about Transnistria and I don't know the exact energy mix here. I'm just not that involved. It's really just about sharing the information here. What you do with the information is up to you. Feel free to drop me a comment if you have any more background info on this. But the way it looks to me at first glance, it seems to me that this is some kind of blackmail attempt. And that's why, as a country, you always have to be very careful about who you accept help from. Because, let's just say, people often have bad underlying motivations. So, it sounds good at first glance. Hey, when you go to someone in need of help and says, hey, I'm here to help you. And now, for example, you get some kind of treatment paid for by me, or I help your country by doing this and that. And then, of course, everyone takes it, especially when you're in a tough spot. But what people often forget is that the situation can get much worse because you end up getting caught in some kind of deals. El Salvador now has the same problem with IVF. In the end, you end up in a devil's kitchen and can't get out of the devil's spiral. No way out. Because then you end up with a loan. You have to stick to certain conditions. By the way, China does the same thing. They finance countries just like that. For example, they financed the big port in Colombo, Sri Lanka. They just said, okay, we'll finance this for you. But China already knew that Sri Lanka had a ton of problems. What happened then? Sri Lanka went bankrupt. Or was there a big state bank failure or a lot of problems? And then China just said, oh yeah, no problem, we gave you the loans. But hey, you guys built that cool port here in Sri Lanka, in Colombo. By the way, you can't pay your loans anymore. So we'll just take the port as payment. And the crazy thing is, in Sri Lanka, there's basically only one big port. And there's only one airport too. That's how it works in the end. Everything about Colombo. And when you have that kind of dominance, which China has now, you can pretty much control the whole country. And it's basically a form of modern colonization. Or is there also the Chinese side street? So in the end, there are a whole bunch of different sneaky tactics being used by the IMF, China, of course, and also by the US and the EU Commission now. And you really have to be super careful not to get into a devil's kitchen there. It looks like Bitcoin mining is now part of these sanctions or attempts at extortion. But folks, don't let them scare you. You can't ban Bitcoin in the long run. I'm putting a link down there on how you can still be safe and secure. You can buy Bitcoin here at 21 Bitcoin with the code BitconHotel. Up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. And I'm going into the sea now. I've got sand all over my face. I put on some sunscreen before digging in the sand. And now I'm obviously going for a swim in the sea. See you later. Peace out.